I pulled into what should have been my quiet ranch driveway and found a goddamn carnival instead. White tents, champagne glasses, and a woman in a power suit standing on my porch with a microphone, auctioning off my land to a crowd of city folks in designer boots who'd never seen a real cow in their lives. She called herself the HOA president, claimed I'd abandoned the property, and when I walked up to my own front door, she had the audacity to call 911 on me for trespassing. What this small-town dictator didn't know was that I'd spent 15 years as a DEA agent, and I'd taken down cartels with less evidence than what she was about to hand me on a silver platter. I'd been gone exactly 18 days. 18. Not offing months. Not 18 years. 18 days visiting my daughter in Seattle after she had surgery. Left my ranch hand Jimmy in charge. Same as I'd done a dozen times before, when duty called during my federal years. The Double M Ranch had been in my family since 1952, and in all that time, nobody had ever questioned who owned the 1,200 acres of prime Montana grazing land that stretched from Beaver Creek all the way to the timberline. My name is Marcus Reed, and I bought this place with my retirement money after 22 years with the Drug Enforcement Administration. Seen enough violence, corruption, and human ugliness to last 3 lifetimes. All I wanted was peace, quiet, and the kind of morning coffee that tastes better when you can see for 30 miles in every direction without spotting another human being. Should have known that was too much to ask for in today's world. The trouble started 6 months ago when Pine Valley Estates decided to build their little slice of suburban paradise just east of my property line. 150 McMansions dropped into what used to be the Peterson wheat fields, complete with an HOA, community standards, and a homeowners association president who apparently thought her authority extended beyond the boundaries of her little kingdom. Veronica Blackwood, 43 years old, recently divorced from a Helena lawyer, and armed with a business degree she'd never used, plus a chip on her shoulder the size of Glacier National Park. She'd moved to Pine Valley Estates to start fresh after her ex-husband cleaned her out in the divorce, and somehow convinced herself that running an HOA would be her path back to relevance and respect. The first time I met Veronica was at the county planning meeting where they discussed the new development. She wore a burgundy blazer, carried a leather portfolio, and spoke with the kind of practiced authority that comes from watching too many legal dramas on television. During the public comment period, she stood up and suggested that existing properties adjacent to Pine Valley Estates should be subject to enhanced community standards to protect the new residents' investment values. I should have paid more attention to that comment. Should have asked what the hell she meant by enhanced community standards. Instead, I figured she was just another city transplant who'd learned to mind her own business once she realized this wasn't some suburban neighborhood where people worried about lawn height and mailbox colors. Boy, was I wrong about that. The harassment started small. A letter in my mailbox welcoming me to the Pine Valley community and informing me about upcoming HOA meetings that, according to Veronica, would be discussing area-wide improvement initiatives. I threw the letter away without reading it twice. Then came the phone calls. Polite at first, asking if I'd received their correspondence and wondering if I planned to attend the next community gathering. Ma'am, I told her during the third call, I appreciate the invitation, but I'm not part of your HOA. I live on my own land, and I'll keep it that way. Mr. Reed, she replied, her voice carrying that special kind of sweetness that's actually a threat. Community cooperation benefits everyone. We're all neighbors here. I hung up on her. Another mistake. Within a week, I started finding people on my property. Not trespassers exactly, but folks who claimed they were surveying the area for the HOA's Landscape Improvement Committee. When I asked them to leave, they got defensive, insisting they had permission to evaluate community-adjacent properties for compliance with county environmental standards. The first time it happened, I figured it was a misunderstanding. These were suburbanites who probably didn't understand property lines or rural etiquette. The second time, I suspected Veronica was testing boundaries. The third time, I knew I was dealing with someone who thought rules applied to everyone except her. That's when I should have called Tom Martinez, my old partner from the Denver field office, who'd retired to become sheriff in nearby Clearwater County. Should have nipped this in the bud before it turned into a full-scale land grab, but I was tired of being the guy who always expects the worst from people, tired of seeing criminal conspiracies behind every annoyance. I wanted to believe that reasonable conversation could solve a simple boundary dispute. Another mistake. With people like Veronica Blackwood, reasonable conversation is just an opportunity to gather intelligence on your weaknesses. The situation escalated when Jimmy found survey stakes driven into my pasture without permission. Professional survey work, complete with official markings and GPS coordinates. When I called the county surveyor's office, they had no record of any approved surveys on my property. When I called Veronica to ask about it, she claimed the HOA was conducting preliminary assessments for future community enhancement projects. What kind of enhancement projects? I demanded. Oh, she said, her voice artificially bright. Trail systems, wildlife corridors, maybe some recreational facilities that would benefit the entire area. That's when I realized Veronica wasn't just testing boundaries. She was actively working to redraw them. I hired my own attorney, Beth Garrison, who'd handled my property purchase when I first moved to Montana. Beth reviewed the survey work and discovered that someone had filed preliminary paperwork with the county claiming my ranch was part of an unincorporated community development zone that could be subject to HOA oversight under certain circumstances. Marcus, Beth told me during our meeting in her Missoula office, this is sophisticated harassment. Someone's been doing homework on property law loopholes, and they're trying to manufacture a legal gray area where none should exist. Beth filed paperwork to clarify my property boundaries and ownership status, which should have ended the matter. Instead, it seemed to motivate Veronica to escalate her campaign. That's when the citations started appearing. I'd come home from town to find official-looking notices taped to my gate, claiming violations of everything from livestock containment standards to agricultural waste management protocols. Each citation carried letterhead from something called the Pine Valley Community Compliance Office and threatened daily fines until the violations were corrected. The citations were complete bullshit. Of course, my ranch had passed every county inspection for decades, and I maintained my property according to state agricultural standards that were stricter than anything an HOA could legally enforce. But the documents looked official enough to fool someone who didn't know better, and I started wondering what Veronica planned to do with them. I got my answer when Jimmy caught two of Veronica's compliance officers photographing my cattle operation from the road. When he approached them, they claimed they were documenting environmental violations for an upcoming legal action. They had cameras, clipboards, and an attitude that suggested they thought they were conducting legitimate government business. That's when I decided to conduct some legitimate government business of my own. My DEA years had taught me how to investigate people who thought they were smarter than the system. More importantly, they'd taught me how to build cases that stick when you finally decide to drop the hammer. I spent the next week making phone calls, reviewing public records, and following paper trails that led straight back to Veronica's manufactured authority complex. What I discovered was a pattern of fraud that went way beyond property line disputes. The Pine Valley Community Compliance Office didn't exist in any official capacity. Veronica had created fake letterhead, appointed herself to a non-existent position, and was collecting compliance fees from property owners who didn't know enough to challenge her authority. She'd been targeting elderly residents, non-English speakers, and anyone else who might be intimidated by official-looking paperwork and threats of legal action. Even worse, she'd been using her fake position to pressure local businesses into paying for community improvement assessments that went straight into accounts she controlled. The woman was running a protection racket disguised as civic duty, and she'd been getting away with it because most people assume someone with official-looking documents must have legitimate authority. I called Tom Martinez and filled him in on what I'd discovered. Jesus? Marcus, Tom said after I laid out the evidence. This woman's been busy. We've had complaints about unauthorized fees and fake citations, but nobody connected it all to the same source. She's been testing the system, I told him, figuring out what she can get away with before anyone pushes back hard enough to matter. Tom agreed to open an investigation, but warned me that building a case would take time. Fraude prosecution require extensive documentation. And Veronica had been careful to operate in legal gray areas that made quick arrests difficult. Meanwhile, Tom advised, watch your back. People like this don't stop escalating until something forces them to stop. He was right about that. While Tom worked the legal angles, Veronica was preparing her biggest move yet. I left for Seattle on a Tuesday morning, planning to stay with my daughter Karen while she recovered from knee surgery. Simple family obligation. The kind that matters more than property disputes or HOA drama. I told Jimmy I'd be gone 2 weeks. Maybe 3. If Karen needed extra help, left him with my attorney's number, the sheriff's contact information, and instructions to call immediately if Veronica or her people showed up again. What I didn't anticipate was that Veronica had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. The flight from Helena to Seattle gave me time to think about how much my life had changed since leaving federal service. 22 years of chasing drug traffickers and money launderers had left me with a deep appreciation for honest work and simple problems. Ranch life was supposed to be about fixing fences, tending cattle, and dealing with the kind of challenges that could be solved with hard work and common sense. Instead, I found myself dealing with a suburban Napoleon who thought she could steal my family's legacy with forged documents and manufactured authority. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd come to Montana to escape criminals, only to find myself targeted by a different kind of predator, one who wore business suits instead of gang colors but was just as ruthless in pursuing what she wanted. Karen's surgery went well, but her recovery was slower than expected. What was supposed to be a 2-week visit stretched into 18 days, during which I barely thought about ranch business. Jimmy called twice to report that everything was quiet, which should have been my first warning that something was wrong. Jimmy Watson had worked for me for 3 years, and in all that time, he'd never described anything as quiet. Jimmy was the kind of ranch hand who noticed everything: stray cattle, broken fence posts, unusual tire tracks, changes in weather patterns. For Jimmy to say everything was quiet meant either nothing was happening or he wasn't allowed to tell me what was happening. I should have pressed him for details. Should have called Beth Garrison to check whether Veronica had filed any new paperwork. Should have trusted the instincts that had kept me alive during 2 decades of federal law enforcement. Instead, I focused on taking care of my daughter and tried to convince myself that Veronica Blackwood's petty harassment campaign would burn itself out in my absence. The biggest mistake of my civilian life. I caught an early flight back to Helena, picked up my truck from long-term parking, and drove through the familiar mountain scenery with the kind of contentment that comes from returning home after too much time away. The Double M Ranch represented everything I'd worked toward during my federal career: independence, security, and the peace that comes from owning something real in a world full of bureaucratic bullshit. That contentment lasted until I turned off Highway 200 onto the gravel road that led to my property. The first thing I noticed were the cars, dozens of them, parked along the road and in what should have been my front pasture. Expensive cars, Mostly luxury SUVs, German sedan, and the kind of pristine pickup trucks that had never hauled anything heavier than golf clubs. The second thing I noticed were the people, well-dressed folks wandering around my property like they were at some kind of outdoor festival, many of them carrying glossy brochures and talking on cell phones. The third thing I noticed was the banner stretched between two poles near my front gate. It read, "Pine Valley Ranch Estates, Premier Lots Now Available." That's when I realized what Veronica Blackwood had been planning all along. I parked at the end of the line of cars and walked toward my house, trying to process what I was seeing. White event tents had been set up across my front lawn. A temporary stage had been constructed on my front porch. People in business attire were clustered around display boards that showed what appeared to be subdivision maps and architectural renderings. And standing center stage, wearing a navy blue power suit and holding a wireless microphone, was Veronica Blackwood herself. Lot number 12 features unobstructed mountain views and direct access to Beaver Creek. She was announcing to a crowd of potential buyers, bidding starts at $400,000. Lot number 12 was my back pasture. I pushed through the crowd, my blood pressure rising with every step. Several people gave me annoyed looks, as if I was some unwashed local who'd wandered into their exclusive real estate event. When I reached the front of the crowd, Veronica spotted me, and her face went through a series of expressions: surprise, recognition, and finally, a cold smile that told me she'd been preparing for this moment. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced into the microphone, "it appears we have an unexpected visitor." "Unexpected?" I called out, my voice carrying across the crowd. "Lady, this is my property. You're standing on my front porch." The crowd turned to stare at me, and I could see confusion spreading across their faces. These were legitimate buyers who thought they were attending a legal land auction. They had no idea they were participating in the largest real estate fraud in Montana history. Veronica, however, was ready for this confrontation. "Sir," she said, her voice taking on the tone of someone addressing a confused elderly person, "this property has been declared abandoned under county regulations and is being offered for community development through proper legal channels." She gestured to two large men in security uniforms who'd been standing near the stage. "If you continue to disrupt this legal proceeding, I'll have to ask security to escort you off the premises." That's when I realized just how deep Veronica's preparation had gone. She hadn't just forged a few documents or collected some illegal fees. She'd created an entire fictional legal framework to justify stealing my ranch, complete with fake paperwork, hired security, and what appeared to be legitimate buyers who had no idea they were being used in a massive fraud scheme. "Ma'am," I said, pulling out my wallet and extracting my driver's license. "My name is Marcus Reed, and this is my property. Has been for 8 years. I've got the deed, the tax records, and about a dozen witnesses who can verify that." Veronica's smile never wavered. "I'm sure you believe that, sire. But the county has determined otherwise. This land was classified as abandoned and has been properly processed for community development under HOA jurisdiction." She turned to address the crowd again. "Ladies and gentlemen, this sometimes happens with former property owners who have difficulty accepting legal changes in ownership status. Our security team is trained to handle these situations." That's when one of her security guards stepped forward and put his hand on my shoulder. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave the property," he said in the kind of voice that suggested he was used to people complying without argument. I looked at his uniform more closely and realized it wasn't real security gear. The patches were homemade, the badge was plastic, and the guy himself looked like he'd been hired from a temp agency. But he was big enough to cause trouble, and I could see that Veronica was hoping for exactly the kind of confrontation that would make me look like a crazy person in front of her buyers. Instead, I smiled and pulled out my cell phone. "You know what?" I said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Let me just call the sheriff's department and get this sorted out." For the first time since I'd arrived, Veronica's confident expression flickered. "That won't be necessary," she said quickly. "This is a civil matter that should be handled through proper legal channels." But I was already dialing Tom Martinez's direct number. "Tom?" I said when he answered. "This is Marcus Reed. I'm standing on my own property, watching someone auction it off to a crowd of buyers. I think you need to get out here." I could hear Tom's chair squeak as he sat up. "Someone's doing what now?" "Long story, but I'm pretty sure we just found the source of those fraud complaints you've been investigating. I'm on my way," Tom said. "Don't do anything dramatic until I get there." I hung up and looked around at the crowd, which had started murmuring among themselves. The buyers were beginning to realize that something wasn't right about this auction, and several of them were already walking back toward their cars. Veronica, however, wasn't ready to give up her show. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, "we're experiencing a minor disruption from someone who apparently doesn't understand current property law. However, our auction will continue as scheduled." She gestured to her fake security guards. "Please ensure that our proceedings aren't further interrupted." That's when things got interesting. The two security guards moved toward me with the kind of purpose that suggested they planned to physically remove me from my own property. But before they could reach me, a familiar voice called out from the back of the crowd, "Well, hell, Marcus. Looks like you got yourself a situation here." I turned to see Jimmy Watson pushing through the crowd, and behind him were three other men I recognized as neighboring ranchers. They'd heard about the auction through the local grapevine and had come to see what kind of circus was happening on the Double M Ranch. "Jimmy?" I called out. "Where exactly have you been for the past 18 days? Jimmy's face reddened. "Been staying in town?" "Boss, this lady here served me with some kind of court order saying I wasn't allowed on the property during the ownership transition." He pulled a folded document from his shirt pocket and handed it to me. It was an impressive-looking legal notice, complete with official seals and authoritative language about temporary property restrictions, pending resolution of abandonment proceedings. Complete bullshit, of course, but sophisticated bullshit that would fool most people who weren't familiar with how real legal documents work. "Jimmy," I said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "this document is fake. There's no such thing as an abandonment proceeding in Montana property law, and no court in this county would issue a restraining order against a ranch hand without a hearing." The crowd was definitely getting restless now. I could see people checking their phones, making calls, and having urgent conversations with each other. Several buyers had already left, and the ones who remained looked like they were starting to regret their decision to attend this auction. Veronica realized she was losing control of the situation. "Security," she called out. "Remove this individual immediately." Her two fake guards moved toward me again, but this time they found themselves facing not just me, but Jimmy and three ranchers who'd spent their lives doing physical work and weren't impressed by guys in costume uniforms. "Boys," said Bill Crawford, who owned the spread north of mine, "I think we got ourselves a misunderstanding here." Bill was 68 years old, built like a tree stump, and had been breaking horses since before these security guards were born. When he stepped forward, they stopped moving toward me and started looking around for a different solution to their problem. That's when Veronica made her biggest mistake of the day. She pulled out her cell phone and dialed 911. "Yes," I heard her say in a loud, clear voice designed to carry across the crowd. "I need to report a trespassing situation. We have an individual who's threatening our community event and refusing to leave private property." I couldn't help but smile. In her desperation to maintain control, Veronica had just committed several felonies in front of dozens of witnesses, Filing a false police report was bad enough. But doing it as part of a real estate fraud scheme was the kind of mistake that turns misdemeanor harassment into serious prison time. While Veronica talked to the 911 dispatcher, I called Beth Garrison. "Beth," I said when she answered, "I need you to get out to my ranch immediately. Bring every piece of documentation we have proving I own this property, and maybe call that friend of yours at the state attorney general's office." "What's happening, Marcus?" "Someone just held a land auction on my front lawn and called the cops when I showed up to object." There was a pause. "They did what?" "I'll explain when you get here. But bring everything. This is about to become a federal case." 20 minutes later, I could see dust clouds approaching from both directions as multiple vehicles raced toward my property. The first to arrive was Tom Martinez in his sheriff's cruiser, followed by 2 deputies and what appeared to be an evidence technician. Right behind them came Beth Garrison in her legal firm's SUV, and bringing up the rear was a convoy of news vehicles that had apparently gotten wind of the story. By this time, most of Veronica's buyers had fled, leaving behind a collection of abandoned tents, display boards, and what appeared to be a significant amount of real estate paperwork. Veronica herself stood near her makeshift stage, surrounded by boxes of documents and looking like a general whose army had deserted in the middle of battle. Tom Martinez approached me first. "Marcus," he said, "explain to me what the hell is going on here." I handed him the fake court order that had been served on Jimmy, along with copies of the fraudulent citations I'd been receiving for months. "Tom, meet Veronica Blackwood, the woman behind those fraud complaints you've been investigating. She's been running a fake HOA enforcement scheme. And today she tried to auction off my ranch to a crowd of legitimate buyers who had no idea they were participating in a real estate fraud." Tom examined the documents, and I could see his expression growing darker with each page. "Ma'am," he called out to Veronica, "I need to speak with you." Veronica approached with the same confident demeanor she'd maintained throughout the auction, apparently convinced that her fake documentation would withstand official scrutiny. "Officer," she said, "I'm glad you're here. This individual has been harassing our community development project and threatening our buyers." Tom held up the fake court order. "Did you create this document?" "That's a legal notice issued through proper channels." Veronica replied, "All of our paperwork has been filed with appropriate county offices." "Ma'am, this document bears the seal of a court that doesn't exist and refers to legal procedures that aren't recognized in Montana. Who created this?" For the first time since I'd arrived, Veronica's confident mask slipped. I was provided with that document by our legal team," she stammered. "What legal team?" Veronica looked around as if searching for support that wasn't there. The Community Compliance Office handles all legal documentation." "Ma'am, there is no Community Compliance Office in this county. You're going to need to come with me for questioning." That's when Veronica completely lost her composure. "This is ridiculous," she shouted, her voice cracking with panic. "I have documentation showing this property was abandoned. I have approval from the county planning office. I have buyers who've made legitimate offers." She gestured wildly at the boxes of paperwork surrounding her makeshift stage. "Everything is legal. Everything is documented. This man has no right to be here." Tom looked at me, then back at Veronica. "Ma'am, this man's name is on the deed to this property. He pays taxes on this land. He's lived here for 8 years. What documentation do you have showing that changed?" Veronica rushed to one of her boxes and pulled out a thick folder. "Property abandonment filing. Approved by the county assessment office," she said, thrusting papers at Tom. "Transfer of stewardship to the Pine Valley Community Development Authority. Legal sale authorization signed by appropriate officials." Tom examined the documents, and I could see him shaking his head. "Ma'am, These documents are forgeries. The signatures don't match county officials. The seals are fake. And several of the offices mentioned don't exist. By this time, Beth Garrison had arrived and was reviewing the paperwork Tom handed her. "Marcus," Beth said after examining Veronica's documents, "this is the most sophisticated property fraud scheme I've ever seen. She's created an entire fictional bureaucracy to justify stealing your ranch." She turned to Tom. "Sheriff, this woman has committed multiple felonies: document forgery, fraud, filing false police reports, and conspiracy to commit real estate fraud. Some of these charges carry federal penalties." Veronica backed away from Tom and Beth, her face pale and her eyes darting around as if looking for an escape route. "You don't understand," she said, her voice rising with desperation. "I invested everything in this project. I borrowed money against future sales. I have contractors lined up. I have buyers committed. This has to work." And there it was. The real motivation behind months of harassment and fraud. Veronica hadn't been trying to steal my ranch out of spite or power hunger. She'd been trying to steal it because she'd already spent money she didn't have on a development project that existed only in her imagination. Tom pulled out his handcuffs. "Veronica Blackwood, you're under arrest for fraud, forgery, filing false police reports, and conspiracy to commit real estate fraud." As Tom read Veronica her rights, I watched the collapse of a woman who'd convinced herself that wanting something badly enough made it legal to steal. She'd built an elaborate fantasy world where she had authority over other people's property, where official-looking documents created reality, and where desperation justified any action necessary to avoid facing the consequences of her own poor decisions. The news crews captured everything, Veronica being led away in handcuffs, the boxes of forged documents being loaded into evidence vehicles, and Beth Garrison explaining to reporters how sophisticated real estate fraud schemes work in rural communities, where people assume their neighbors are acting in good faith. Later that evening, after the media circus had departed and the last of the evidence had been collected, I sat on my front porch with Jimmy, Bill Crawford, and Tom Martinez, sharing a bottle of whiskey and watching the sun set over the mountains. I'd almost lost to a suburban wannabe dictator. "Marcus," Tom said, "in 30 years of law enforcement, I've never seen anything quite like this. That woman created an entire fictional government to justify stealing your property. How long do you think she'll get?" Jimmy asked. Tom considered the question. "Federal real estate fraud carries up to 20 years, and she committed multiple counts. State forgery charges add another 5 to 10. She's looking at serious prison time." "What about the people who bought lots?" I asked. "They were victims too," Tom replied. "Most of them will get their money back through restitution, and the state will probably set up a victim compensation fund for the rest." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the sounds of cattle settling in for the night and coyotes calling to each other across the valley. This was what I'd moved to Montana for: peace, quiet, and the kind of simple problems that could be solved with honest work and common sense. "You know," Bill said, breaking the silence, "that woman made one big mistake." "What's that?" I asked. "She picked the wrong guy to mess with." Bill was right about that. Veronica Blackwood had targeted someone she assumed would be an easy victim, a retired federal agent living alone on a remote ranch. Someone who might not have the resources or energy to fight back against her sophisticated fraud scheme. What she didn't realize was that 22 years with the DEA had taught me exactly how to investigate, document, and prosecute people who thought they were smarter than the system. More importantly, it had taught me that criminals always make mistakes when they think they're winning. Veronica's mistake was assuming that fake authority would triumph over real evidence. She'd spent months creating elaborate documentation to support her fictional claim to my property. but she'd never bothered to check whether I had the knowledge and resources to expose her fraud. The trial took place 6 months later in federal court in Billings. Veronica's defense attorney tried to argue that she'd been misled by bad legal advice and had genuinely believed she had authority to manage abandoned properties. The argument might have worked if she hadn't been caught on video auctioning off my ranch to legitimate buyers while I was standing in front of her, objecting to the entire process. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before finding her guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced her to 15 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised release, during which she was prohibited from holding any position of authority in property management or community organizations. During her sentencing hearing, Veronica made a statement asking for mercy and claiming that she'd never intended to hurt anyone. She talked about the financial pressures she'd faced after her divorce, the dreams she'd had for contributing to community development, and the mistakes she'd made in pursuit of those dreams. What she never did was apologize to the people she'd victimized or acknowledge that her mistakes were actually calculated crimes designed to steal other people's property. The judge wasn't impressed with her self-serving testimony. "Miss Blackwood," he said during sentencing, "you created an elaborate criminal enterprise designed to defraud honest property owners out of their land. You forged government documents, impersonated officials, and used fake authority to intimidate vulnerable people into compliance with your illegal demands. This wasn't a mistake driven by financial pressure. This was a deliberate criminal conspiracy that you pursued for months, despite numerous opportunities to stop before causing serious harm." He paused to review his notes. "The court finds that your actions represent a serious threat to the property rights that form the foundation of our legal system. People must be able to trust that owning property means something, that government documents are authentic, and that community leaders operate within the law rather than above it." The sentence sent a message that resonated throughout rural Montana and beyond. Within weeks of Veronica's conviction, attorneys general in several states opened investigations into similar HOA fraud schemes, and state legislatures began considering laws to strengthen penalties for property-related fraud. The Pine Valley Estates development was eventually completed under new management, with legitimate oversight and actual compliance with county regulations. The new HOA operates according to standard bylaws that apply only to properties within the development boundaries, and they've never shown any interest in expanding their authority beyond those limits. As for me, I'm still living on the Double M Ranch, raising cattle and enjoying the peace I originally came to Montana to find. The attempted theft of my property taught me valuable lessons about vigilance, community, and the importance of standing up to people who think fake authority gives them real power over other people's lives. I've also learned that criminals like Veronica Blackwood aren't unique. They're everywhere, in HOAs, community organizations, local governments, and any other place where a little bit of authority can be leveraged into a lot of control over other people's property and freedom. The key to stopping them is understanding that their power exists only as long as people believe it exists. Once you challenge their authority with real evidence and actual law, their elaborate facades collapse like houses of cards in a Montana wind. Sometimes the best way to protect what you own is to remember that you own it, and to be willing to fight anyone who tries to convince you otherwise. The aftermath of Veronica's conviction brought unexpected changes to our entire community. Within weeks of her sentencing, I started receiving visitors, property owners from across the state who'd heard about my case and wanted advice on dealing with similar harassment from their own HOAs or local officials. It seemed like Veronica's scheme had been part of a larger pattern of property rights abuse that was happening throughout rural America. One particular visitor stands out in my memory. An elderly couple named Frank and Margaret Hendricks drove 300 miles from eastern Montana to tell me about their ongoing battle with a county commissioner who was trying to force them off their family farm through selective code enforcement. They'd been fighting the harassment for 2 years, spending their retirement savings on legal fees, and were close to giving up when they heard about my case on the news. "Mr. Reed," Frank said as we sat on my porch, "seeing what you did gives us hope that we can fight back too." I spent the afternoon reviewing their documentation and was shocked at the similarities to what Veronica had done. The same pattern of fake citations, manufactured violations, and official-looking paperwork designed to intimidate people into compliance with illegal demands. The only difference was that their harassment was coming from an elected official instead of a fake HOA president. I called Beth Garrison and Tom Martinez, and within a week we'd connected the Hendricks with attorneys and investigators who specialized in government corruption cases. 6 months later, that county commissioner was facing federal charges for abuse of office and property rights violations. The experience taught me that my fight with Veronica hadn't been just about protecting my ranch. It had been about protecting a principle that affects every property owner in America: the idea that owning land means something, and that no one has the right to steal it through fake authority and manufactured legal processes. I also learned that standing up to bullies creates a ripple effect that goes far beyond the immediate situation. Every time someone successfully challenges fake authority, it makes it easier for the next person to do the same. Veronica's conviction didn't just protect my property, it protected the property rights of countless other people who might have been victimized by similar schemes. These days, I still get calls from attorneys handling property rights cases, and I'm always willing to share what I learned about investigating and exposing fake authority schemes. My DEA experience gave me tools that most property owners don't have, and I figure it's my responsibility to help others protect what's theirs. The Double M Ranch is more peaceful now than it's been since I bought it. The cattle graze undisturbed, the fences stay mended, and I can drink my morning coffee without worrying about finding fake citations taped to my gate. Veronica Blackwood learned the hard way that stealing someone's property requires more than fake documents and manufactured authority. Sometimes it requires dealing with someone who knows the difference between real law and bureaucratic bullshit. And in my experience, that's a lesson worth teaching to anyone who thinks they can take what doesn't belong to them. The months following Melody's sentencing brought unexpected changes to our small community. Without the oppressive oversight of her HOA regime, neighbors began talking to each other again. Property values actually increased, as word spread that Willowbrook Estates was now free from authoritarian management and hidden fees. The mayor even issued a public statement praising the community's decision to self-govern, citing it as a model for other neighborhoods struggling with HOA overreach. I found myself becoming an unofficial consultant for other property owners facing similar situations. Word had spread through law enforcement networks about the Thornfield case, and I regularly received calls from federal agents and local detectives investigating HOA fraud in their jurisdictions. It turned out that Melody's scheme wasn't unique. Across the country, power-hungry board members were using their positions to enrich themselves while hiding behind claims of community service. The most satisfying follow-up came 6 months later, when I received a handwritten letter from a group of actual youth program organizers in the county. They'd used the publicity from Melody's fake charity to raise legitimate funds for their programs, ultimately collecting more money than she'd stolen. They invited me to attend their annual awards ceremony, where they presented a plaque recognizing my role in exposing the fraud that had initially threatened their reputation. My ranch hosted that ceremony, a real one this time, with proper authorization and genuine charitable purpose. Watching kids receive scholarships and program funding in the same pasture where Melody had staged her elaborate deception felt like the perfect completion of a circle. The land that she'd tried to exploit for personal gain had become the setting for authentic community support and hope. Sometimes the best revenge isn't what you do to someone, it's watching the truth do its work while you simply get back to living your life with integrity. Melody thought she could steal my property and my peace. But instead, she gave me the opportunity to protect both while serving justice one more time. Not a bad outcome for a retired federal agent who just wanted to enjoy his grandfather's ranch in quiet solitude.